Alright loves, make yourself a cuppa because I'm about to spill the tea on my chateau. Giving you a brief overview of what's to come. My chateau was built in the 13th century, then was destroyed during the Wars of Religion. Then it was the seat of two different lords, and then it went into who knows what. That's kind of the unknown history after the French Revolution. In case you're new here, my name is Amadeus, I'm 37 years old and I live in one of the most rural areas in France in half of a medieval chateau, and today you're gonna hear about its history. This is history part 2. If you haven't watched part 1, then I'd recommend you start with that one, and then we're gonna move to part 2 because I have some other details that I just found out. So if you're a history and chateau aficionado, you say that? I don't know. Stick around. Alright. Let's pour some tea. Do you want to come here? Anita wants my attention. Each time I start talking to the camera, my dog Anita comes. Allez, up, stay up. Oui, comme ça. So, my co-anchor for today, Anita. Whip it. So, first of all, definition of a chateau, because I've had some comments where people say like, oh, but everybody starts calling their places a chateau. Yes, but no. Because this, where I live, is a proper medieval chateau. So let's go back to kind of the explaining what a chateau actually is. It comes from the Latin word castel, and it basically means a fortified house, a fortified manor. So originally a chateau was a seat of a seigneur or a lord, which this was. If you'll keep on watching, you'll find out who was the lord of this chateau. Chateau can be separated into two categories, and I have a little cheat sheet here. It's fortified versus ornamental. So medieval chateau, like this one, built with defensive purposes in mind, often featuring moats, towers, and thick walls to withstand sieges. Akin to the German Burg, because in German, actually, in the German language, we separate between Burg and Schloss. So Burg is more of this fortified manner like it is here. You can see there's many spots and places around the chateau where they used to shoot out of as well, shoot arrows. Like all my openings in the second floor are basically arrow hatches. Arrow hatches? I don't know if you would call it that way. But basically they were meant to shoot from. And you have the little turret on this side as well. It was to look out and to look. Anita also wants to look out. And then you have the Renaissance and later chateau, which these transition to more decorative and luxurious residencies, showcasing wealth and status rather than focusing on defense. So this is what we would call in German Schloss. So we make this difference, but lots of other languages actually don't really make the difference between them two. So basically what I live in is a medieval chateau. And yes, it is a chateau. And yes, over time, when there has been like a long trajectory of noble families living somewhere, and also past the French Revolution, then chateaus were added upon. You know, you might have had a medieval structure like this one, and then something was added to in the 17th and 18th century. So that's why we end up with basically, for example, Chateau de la Lande is exactly that way. It started off as a medieval structure, but it was built on and with more and more comforts going forward. This never happened to this building, because this building just at one point was abandoned and left after the French Revolution. And just one last word on that whole chateau thing. Many chateaus are actually quite small, and they were really just meant to be fortified manors, something that would protect someone. And many of them didn't make it through the French Revolution, or after the French Revolution just went into the estate, or they just went on to other families and didn't stay in noble families, because during the French Revolution, there was a lot of turmoil, obviously, and the monarchy was abolished. That's how many chateaus didn't evolve on to this point. And there's other chateau examples. For example, I mean, you guys also watched Chateau de Landigny, and Landigny is a perfect example of that. It started off as a lodge somewhere, you know, like a small kind of fortified manor as well as a chateau, and then it evolved. At one point, a lot of the structure was built on in the 19th and early 20th century by very wealthy people who wanted just to show status. It was made to believe it was old, but it's not actually a proper old place. You know, yes, it's old in standards of like, is it 100, 200 years old? Yes, but it's not as old as here, for example, where probably the most of the outside walls date back to the 13th century. I'm gonna give you a closer look on the whole history dating from the 13th century until the end of the French Revolution, kind of giving you an idea who was living here and what their function was, and putting it all into a historical context. So let's start with the wars of religion. There is not many documents overall left because of this wars of religion and then the French Revolution. So it's just really hard to find also in archives, because I think some of you also mentioned archives. Lots of archives were in the mairies, in the town halls. So these were burned down during the French Revolution mostly, so it's really, really hard to find old documents if they hadn't been hidden very, very well. And unfortunately, all of these things here in Lessignac were burned or cannot be found. The Wars of Religion in the 1500s, exactly from 1562 to 1598. I can't remember all these numbers, so I'm sorry, I will have to read some of that part. So basically it was a huge divide between the two Christian beliefs, between the Catholics and the Protestants. And the Protestants in France were the Huguenots, and that's why a lot of them actually went to Germany later on in the northern and eastern parts of Germany. For example, in Kassel, where my parents live and where I grew up, they have a Hugenotenstraße, a street that is named from them. And they always had, I think, 5 windows in their houses. So it's, I think there's a street also called the Fünf-Fenster-Straße, which is the 5-window street. So basically it was the wars of belief between those two parties. The Charente region was kind of on the outskirts of this wars, but this chateau was destroyed during this wars. So as you can see, it was still a very dramatic time. Also during that time, many noble homes were fortified, if they weren't already, or were destroyed. There was the Edict of Nantes, which happened in 1598, and it brought temporary peace until it was revoked by Louis XIV in 1685. To understand the context of the people who've been here and who've resided here, I have to explain something else. That is the presidial courts. And the presidial courts were actually introduced by Henry II on 1552. That's quite early, wasn't it? So these were basically the entities that communicated between the lower courts and the parliament in Paris. They were handling civilian and criminal cases, usually for nobility, for merchants, you know, for the upper class, as I would say it. So there was a presidial court in Angoulême for the Angoumois region, and the Charente was part of this Angoumois region, which was quite a big region back then. And these courts had judges and councillors, and one of those councillors was Antoine Thomas, who was the Sieur de Lessignac, and he was the Lord of Lessignac. So he was one of the councillors in that presidial court in Angoulême. The last thing I can add to this is that the presidial courts were part of a centralized system to strengthen royal authority in the provinces. So how could you imagine Charente, where we are right now in the 16th to 18th century? Well, it isn't that different from it actually as it is now. A lot of rolling hills, a lot of forests and rivers. It was economically focused on agriculture, viticulture and small-scale industry. It was known for its local trade routes that were going to Angoulême, to Limoges and to Bordeaux. So there was quite a lot of traffic going through here. So this area was dominated by noble estates, small towns and peasant communities. And the nobility played a key role in the governance of all of this, obviously. So this chateau was very likely a center of local power where judgment was made. It was managing agricultural production, for example. Gatherings were hosted here, and all these sort of things were happening exactly here. So who were those families that lived exactly in this building, in this chateau? And when I heard about it, or when I read about it just now, I think I came across it about like a month ago, and then I reread it and I was like, oh, I need to share this with you guys and I need to make a video about this, obviously. So going back to my cheat sheet. So in the 17th century, it was the Thomas family that lived here, and as I mentioned already, that Thomas was a councillor in the Angoulême court. In 1635, Lionel Thomas, who was the lord of Barrière de Saint-Quentin, which Saint-Quentin is really close here, and he was the owner of the chateau back then. And then afterwards, there's a mention of Antoine Thomas, who was the lord of Lesignac, and who served as a councillor at the presidial court. That's all that there is to know and all that there is to find out about 17th century here. We know that apparently, so in the 1600s, this all must have been rebuilt, and probably it's where all the wood structure and beams were added. I think I already talked about this in the first episode where I mentioned this. So if you think about it, it was built in the 1300s, then 1500 something, it was destroyed during the War of Religions. And then comes in 1600 another noble family, probably, because prior to that there was a noble family as well, who rebuilt this. And I mean, you can already see it by the thickness and the thickness of the walls, the logs that must have gone in here. I mean, it's the amount of wood. This would have been somebody extremely rich by that time. I mean, not as rich as those people in Versailles, obviously, but someone who was very rich. And then in the 18th century, there is records of the Durousseau family living here. The chateau became property of the Durousseau family in the 18th century, so 1700 something. We don't know when exactly. We do know that the Marshal Durousseau was a lord who passed away in this chateau September 22nd, 1755, leaving behind 2 orphans. Then later on, there is a recording of Jacques Durousseau, who was also lord of Lesignac-Durand. By that time, it's already documented as Lesignac-Durand, not only Lesignac. And he died in the chateau as well, May 12th, 1796. His son then, Antoine Durousseau, was tragically assassinated during the French Revolution. So just to give you a bit of more context, timely context, so the French Revolution started in 1789 and it went till 1799. That's when lots of royalty was killed, or the other solution was for them to join the clergy and go into monasteries and become nuns and priests. That's because a nun or a priest couldn't be royalty, so they were saved from the guillotine. So during the revolution, a lot of things shifted, and ownerships and the governance of all these things were totally different after the revolution, and nobility lost its power, and with that, a lot of times also their chateau. So there is 2 escutcheons. I don't even know if you say it that way, if you pronounce it that way. Correct me if I'm wrong, I'm very sorry. English is not my first language, although I do speak it quite well. So there's 2 escutcheons of heraldic symbols that also place a date on the building itself, which is 1567. So, you know, it goes back quite a long way. One of them also shows symbols, but those symbols cannot be kind of let into some other people's or some other noble families' symbols. So it remains a mystery. I don't film them because I don't really have the right, because one of them is right behind me on the little part that's still behind there, and the other part is with my neighbors, and I don't want to fly a drone into my neighbor's garden. You can already see, I mean, this chimney or this fireplace is a medieval fireplace that has been transformed over time and time again, absolutely, but just the sheer size of this is unbelievable. It's over 2 meters wide. I mean, if you put it in context, it's really crazy. What also remains, and I did a quick short on this, is all these elements like here. Somebody mentioned the crack, that they're kind of worried about the crack. The crack is fine, it hasn't moved. So far, I am not concerned about the crack, but it is a medieval opening. Either it was used as a door, as a passageway for servants, or it was also used as a storage, you know, like an alcove to store or an alcove for religious objects. We have the medieval sink, which was basically how they all did their washing up. So like any kind of stone sink, it is very shallow, and I currently use it as my wood storage. So the chateau has been renovated and used for a lot of different purposes, and for a long time it was left to just rot away basically, and nobody really cared about the building until the previous owners actually bought it, and it did undergo a huge renovation there. I think that's when they brought in real electricity, like the electrics that are here now. They brought in central heating. All these things were added. But there are things like this, for example, this passageway that is still an original medieval passageway, and this remains one of my only door openings actually in the chateau that is a proper door, and it leads to the guest room where usually my parents stay. So I'm really hoping that I gave you an idea of what all things a chateau can be and what can be called a chateau. So our takeaway is that a chateau is a fortified home basically, or a seat of a noble person, which both of these things apply to this chateau. It's a medieval structure that dates back to the 1300s. It's just so crazy to be living in such a thing, and also that it's not protected. You know, in Germany usually these kinds of buildings would be heavily protected and they would be listed. In France, most of those buildings aren't listed, which is a good and a bad thing, if you would want to say it, because it really allows for people to come in and change them and adapt them to their living situations, and it really allows you to make those places homes for people, you know. And I think that's really important with the housing problem that we're having everywhere, that it is very expensive to renovate a historic home already, but if your home is listed, it's even more expensive. So I'm kind of like a yay and nay person when it comes to historic homes, and here it would be classified as a monument historique, which luckily we aren't. And if I would advise you, if you're looking for a chateau or a historical building to buy in France, then I would recommend dearly that you do not buy something that's a monument historique, because it will be a money pit, and chateaus already are money pits. So Anita and me hope you had fun in this week's episode, and that I could tell you a bit more about the chateau and the place I live in, and the place I keep on renovating on a very low budget. So if you like to support my journey, then subscribe to my channel and follow along. And all that is left to say is à bientôt et au revoir from the southwest of France. We shall see each other next week with a new video. Until then, bisous and bye!